A very warm welcome to everybody. It's a great turnout. Also welcome to anybody who just happens to watch us. We're streamed online on YouTube, and the link afterwards the video afterwards will be available if you ever want to look back. So my name is Jan van den Heuvel. For those who don't know me, I'm a member here at the mathematics department, and we were asked to one of us to chair it. So it's my great pleasure to chair this, in a sense, the first joint event organized by the LSE Applicable Mathematics Society and the Department of Mathematics. I must say, although jointly organized, the society people did most of the work, in particular the hard work, so well done to them. So we hope that this is not the first event. We would be more than happy to see more things happening jointly, and we would be very happy to support them. So let's get to the main item of the evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Danny Quah. Danny is professor at the LSE here in the Department of Economics. He has been at the LSE for quite a while. I won't embarrass him by telling you when he started at the LSE. For most of you, it wouldn't mean much because you weren't born. Before that, he also had spent some time in little-known places like Harvard and Princeton and MIT before coming to LSE. And during his time as LSE, he has been doing other jobs, advising countries, advising the Bank of England, advising Malaysia National Economic Advisory Council, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, etc., etc. He has been head of the Department of Economics for a couple of years. It seems possible to recover from that quite well, which I'm very happy to learn. So today's talk he will give on using mathematics, making big economics visible to the human eye. We, as mathematicians, always like to see nice and good applications of mathematics, so we're definitely going to look forward to an interesting talk. As a final a housekeeping, in order to keep an eye on the time, to be able to do the timing precisely, we prefer not to do questions during the talk. There will be plenty of room for questions afterwards, so please keep your questions until after that, and we do a proper question and answer session. Absolutely guaranteed. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And thank you all for taking up this evening in the last week of term to come here and be part of this conversation. I'm not thinking of this as a straight lecture. Jan has suggested what I will try and do is speak for about 45 minutes, and then we can have question and answer about what exactly is being done here. I'm well aware how just very recently there have been other events at LSE, people who are interested in economics. There was, for instance, a debate between some very good friends of mine about whether there was too much mathematics already in economics, how history fit in all this. And, to give a talk now on using mathematics seems a little bit presumptuous on the results of that. I'm firmly of the view that there are all kinds of interesting ideas that cannot be attacked with mathematics, and focusing too much on mathematics can sometimes give us the wrong picture. But also I hope that it'll be clear, I'm not at all doctrinaire in a model of the world in how I approach economics in the world. I'm not doctrinaire about how we have to have markets. In fact, what I'm going to talk about here doesn't talk about markets, doesn't talk about market imperfections. It's not that kind of a talk. It's a talk about sort of using mathematics to try and bring out some features of the world, and using mathematics to bring out some features of the world that might not be immediately obvious otherwise, or using mathematics to attack questions that are too complicated to try and do otherwise. And so this is not a should we use mathematics, or should we use history, or should we use political science or something else. I'm trying to go after questions. For me, it is the questions that are primary, and then I go as far as I can with what tools I've got, and then I look around and see what else I can learn from very smart people, mathematicians, people in other fields to try and bring to bear a resolution on that question. It's not a doctrinaire line that I'm going to take on how we must use mathematics to do this, or we must not use mathematics to do that. They're just facts about the world that I think are important to understand. So what are those facts of the world? Well, there's an outline to what I'm going to talk about, but let me jump to those facts of the world. Here is a fact that will drive some of my discussion, and it is a very simple fact. It is a fact that comes from the web, really. Comes from a friend of mine, Ken Myers, who some time ago put up this map. He put it up, for those of you who are into that kind of a dialogue, that kind of a conversation, he put it up on Reddit, but because Reddit is a site that only allows you to link to images that are secure in particular ways, he linked it to an image that he put on Imager, or, it's spelled Imgur, but of course it's pronounced Imager. An Imager does not typically let you put identifying information like who created the map or otherwise. This was simply a map he put on Imager that he then described on Reddit. This is the map of the world, and it's a map that draws a circle on it. And he said, and this map, the circle on it, simply makes a bald assertion. There are more people living inside the circle than outside. A number of things strike you when you look at the map. And there's the same kind of thing that struck tens of millions of people who have seen this map in a way that's uncredited, in a way that they had no idea it was Ken Myers who had produced it, but in a way that resonated with them. He simply put up this map and said more people live inside the circle than others. And the Washington Post picked it up, the New York Times, the Economist, practically every news outlet, every news aggregator out there on the internet put up this map. Aggregator sites put it up as number 13 on 40 maps that help us understand the world. So it made its rounds. Scores of millions of people have seen this map. And Ken described it to me. Actually, most people think of this map in a way that doesn't associate with his name. They think of this as something that they call the Valery Pieris circle. Valery Pieris circle refers to a person who doesn't even exist anymore. He did this as kind of an inside joke for himself and his family, but that's how the world knows this map. Now, all that is just background. What's interesting to you and me is that this map is just plain wrong. First of all, what he's drawn there as a circle is actually not a circle, because the world is three-dimensional. A planet sits as a three-dimensional sphere. So what appears as a circle on this map is actually not a circle on Earth. And in fact, the circles that you draw on two-dimensional maps show up as things that are quite different and strange on circles that you and I, as mathematicians, as social scientists, as people who want to understand the world, might identify. It is not a circle. It is a projection. But what makes it interesting, someone, Robbie Gonzalez, pointed out in a discussion of this, is that this visualization is very straightforward. It is dead wrong. It comes from no theorem. It involves no calculation. There's no optimization, no variational problem that it solves. But it draws a resonance for people out there, so that tens of millions of people, scores of millions of people were drawn to it. It shows up on maps that help us understand the world. What are some of the implications of a map like this? Well, once you start thinking about this map, this is where consumption of natural resources might happen. This is where population is dense. The kind of government that emerges in this little circle represents the democratic majority of the population on this earth. It tells us about political ideologies. It tells us about how human populations are going to evolve. It tells us about international relations in the world, economic performance, patterns of famine, poverty, starvation, water usage. It tells us about a whole bunch of things, and it comes from something that is actually incorrect and inaccurate. What's drawn here is not a circle. There was no theorem that said this circle is interesting or distinguished in any way. The way Ken Myers explained it to me, he said, look, one evening, I had a few glasses of alcohol, And I noticed that where I was living at the time, the Philippines had this population, hubbub, had this noise hubbub about it. So he pulled out Wikipedia and a bunch of other sources of information. He counted up that in China, India, Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines were all large population countries. And he said, can I, in this map that's ahead of me, that's in front of me, draw a circle that encompasses all these countries, and then lo and behold, this circle contains the democratic majority of the world's population. Isn't it interesting that in this circle, which is not a circle, which occupies only 1/6 of the world's land area, more than half of the world's population lives in it? Now, you and I, other academics, scientists, scholars, might start to ask questions about this map. What would happen if we tried to draw the map differently? What if we tried to draw it in a three-dimensional sphere? Is there a variational or optimization problem that this map solves? Can we characterize the state of societies that live in this non-circle, but that we can try and make circular? Okay. So why do I take us through this little calculation, this little detour? This is an example of what I think of as Edward Tufte, the great statistician, visual designer at Yale University, calls minimizing the ink impact ratio. You want to talk as a social scientist, as a scholar, as an investigator of the things around us. We want to talk about things that matter to people. Yes, sometimes the demand for refrigerators is hugely interesting. It's hugely interesting to Westinghouse, to Haier, to the companies that make refrigerators. But on a global scale, the demand for refrigerators might not be that hugely interesting. Lots of ink has been spilled on the demand for refrigerators. So Edward Tufte's view, not in this context, but in terms of using maps, visual information, representing information, he said, what is it that as scholars, as scientists who want to communicate to the general public, what are the principles we should keep in mind? One of those principles, he said, we should be trying to minimize the ink information ratio. We shouldn't be splashing our journal pages with lots of redundant information that don't tell people anything. We should be trying to minimize the ink information ratio. That is the mindset I want to take us into this discussion. I will want to lay out for you the kinds of questions that I find interesting. It's terribly self-indulgent, but then you know what? Every research paper proceeds that way. Every research paper comes up with, I'm going to tell you what I find interesting, then I'm going to tell you lots of ink about how I solve that problem. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to tell you what I find interesting. But I hope that the things I talk about are things that have low ink impact ratio. The kinds of things that, to describe them the same way that Ken Myers described in that circle, takes just a little bit of doing. It's just a little bit of play sometimes with the graphics program. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it's a lot of work. But nonetheless, we should be mindful as scholars, as academics, as scientists who want to communicate to the rest of the world, the excitement that we feel about the questions that we address. We should be trying to minimize the ink impact ratio, the ink information ratio. What does economics do when it tries as a field, or actually not just economics, but most other fields, political science is going the same way, when it tries to communicate to people its discoveries? Okay? In economics now, those of you who are economics undergraduates here and you're learning econometrics from Mostly Harmless Econometrics or other similar expositions, a lot of the emphasis there is about causality and different ways in which we extract causality. It might be randomized controlled trials, it might be clever use of instruments, it might be thinking hard about the natural experiment that's in front of you. It's about causality. Okay? So a large chunk of the things that economists now spend their ink and their time on are models of causality. And that's hugely important. Okay? Stepping back a little bit, it's about program evaluation. If we're trying to think about how treatment of malaria tablets, of mosquito nets, of applying textbooks in different ways, treatment results in certain effects on villagers in India. on development in different African countries. It's program evaluation. Causality is a lot about that. And yes, it extends beyond that. It extends to how we control the money supply. It extends to how different kinds of disturbances affect the economy. Causality is a huge part of economics empirical discourse. Causality doesn't seem to figure prominently in how people think about that Valerie Pierre's circle and the implications that that has for the allocation of resources on our planet, on how we run global governance, on what systems of democracy ought to work for which societies. Yeah, causality eventually does want to come in, but it's not the first thing that strikes one, that catches the resonance, that grabs people on the impact ratio. Okay. Now, to be clear, what I'm saying here is not at all a statement against anything that anybody else does. I'm just telling you that if we begin with the idea that we want to have an impact in communication, minimize the impact ratio on large problems that affect millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people, causality might not be where we begin. For looking at program evaluation, that's where we want to go, and that's hugely important, no question. In macroeconomics, those of you, who were thinking about, who've done macroeconomics either at the undergraduate or higher levels, you'll know that the way in which many macroeconomists approach their analysis now uses dynamic, stochastic, calibrated general equilibrium models. That's the way in which we bring to bear information about the world, values of parameters, elasticities of substitution in production, elasticities of different demand parameters, and we put them into a dynamic, stochastic general equilibrium model that we calibrate, that we then carry out exercises on. And we use that to reflect on whether the macroeconomic phenomenon that we're interested in matters, and it matters hugely. And that's, again, another very important part of our tool set. For me, in terms of the question that I set out and that I want to expand on, it doesn't seem to be exactly where the rubber hits the road. It doesn't seem to be where traction is greatest. Big data is a third large area where people, scholars of all kinds, statisticians, economists, political scientists, all try to bring to bear data about the world, facts about the world, and the questions that are of interest to them. And that's wide open. And how people are using big data now in all kinds of interesting, innovative ways, that's hugely exciting. I think it would be a loss if we somehow shoehorned big data into either just thinking about causality or thinking about dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models. In other words, simply thinking of big data as more data rather than something really essentially different. That's wide open. Let me leave that up for you. But then what I want to leave us with from this discussion is the question, do we think these are the only possible lines of attack for every empirical question that's interesting in social science? Those who push causality, randomized control trials, instrumental variables, other ways in which we get at causality, do sometimes try and project the idea that every interesting question in economics is about cause and effect. Maybe they're right. I'm willing to be a little bit agnostic at this point. I don't think that economics is just program evaluation, no matter how clever program evaluation is. I think there are lots of large questions that aren't usefully treated in any of these ways. Let me now go to some data and tell a story about following the sequence of data that then leads us to wanting to get to a point where mathematics screams to be let into the picture. You get to a point where you say, I've gone as far as I can. The only way I'm going to make progress is by being really clever with the mathematical tools, and I have no recourse. This is how I've got to do this. Okay, this is, at first blush, a straightforward picture of the GDP, per capita GDP of 4 countries, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and the United States, and put to one side whether Taiwan is really a country. It is a nation state in the IMF's balance of payment statistics. That's what I'm using. The green line that appears there is Singapore. Singapore's per capita GDP grew rapidly. The purple or violet line that appears uppermost in the picture for most of this history from the 1950s on through a few years ago is the United States. From this, we take the fact that the United States was for a long time the world's richest country in per capita average person terms, but actually from the early 2000s, no longer the case. No longer the case, not just exceeded by Singapore, but by other countries around the world. Now, someone who is so ingrained in thinking about these ways of approaching data, of using these ways to think about addressing important questions in the world, might look at this picture and say, okay, you know what I've got to do? I've got to, first of all, model each univariate series here as an ARMA process, mixed moving average autoregression process. And then it's got a trend, so I've got to decide, is that trend deterministic or exponential? Is it linear? Or am I going to model it as a unit root process, as an integrated stochastic process? And then you realize, well, actually, I'm interested in this not just in isolation, but I want to model these as a multivariate, co-integrated vector stochastic process. And I spent a lot of time going to working out the right model for this. And in doing all this, most researchers who've gone through that will miss what I think is the most important point in this picture. That is, that the United States was overtaken by once a third world country. Not all third world emerging countries have been able to do that. Singapore did. That, for me, is the large impact information fact in this picture. That most of our standard tools either dismiss as trivial or go off and model something completely different. Those who model time series do not think about one series overtaking another. That's not of interest. Those who might want to model these trends would be dismissed as doing something completely trivial because you've just looked at one trend overtaking another. What's the fascination in that? What's so fascinating about one country becoming richer than another? In this instance, Singapore overtaking the United States. It becomes a little bit more obvious when we realize that actually people out in the real world are hugely interested in this kind of a dynamic. Here's the headline in the Financial Times from over a year ago. And it pointed out the same kind of fact that you and I have just been looking at. China poised to pass the United States as the world's leading economic power this year. Now, those of us, like me, when I teach time series Economic 402 to MSc economics students, this is not a fact that we are interested in. We are interested in trying to model the mixed moving average autoregressive properties of multivariate time series. We completely miss what people out there consider to be the large important fact. What's so important about this fact? Well, what's quite important about this fact is what other social scientists think of this fact, not just the Financial Times reading one line crossing the other. Here's a typical statement from how other social scientists might have approached either of those two facts that I told you just about. Yes, on the one hand, China's growth has lifted hundreds of a third world country that's learning about how to become a responsible member of global society. It is rebuilding its structures, it's all experimenting with alternate systems of political governance, all that's hugely interesting. In lifting so many people out of poverty, in removing its status from third world poor nation to rich one, it is, in the words of Pope Francis, endowing its people to become empowered and dignified agents of their own destiny. This is happening to 1 billion people. This is hugely important. Empirical work that tries to understand the multivariate stochastic properties of these time series, which is the empirical work that most of us do, because that's what most of us spend our time doing on, does not get at that. But if that were all that was going on, that might not be so interesting. Here's what's going on. When people look at this picture, they don't marvel at Pope Francis and to say 1 billion people have been lifted, 600 million people have been lifted out of poverty. They say instead this: China's rise is a challenge to the established order. Competition between these two nations that the FT put on its front page is inevitable. And China will soon challenge the United States for global hegemony, for the right to run the world, for the legitimacy to write the rules of the game. Now, all of a sudden, everything, in my mind, that we were talking about earlier with Ken Myers' picture, suddenly, for me, comes rushing in here. Ken Myers, in this very simple characterization, described a set of forces that he didn't pursue very much further. He said, this was interesting, let me just put it here. But there's a whole other kind of discussion going on with our colleagues here at the school. What I mean by that is other social scientists, not just here at the school, but everywhere in the world, on these kinds of issues. And you know what? As economists or as other social scientists who have looked at the statistical stochastic time series properties of GDP data, we miss exactly this. And is it so bad to miss this? Are these the rantings of some crazed right-wing Donald Trump type person out there who's worrying about China and the United States? Well, actually no, because very distinguished scholars worldwide worry about this. John Mearsheimer is a very distinguished political scientist and international relations scholar at the University of Chicago, and the way he describes the world is not a million miles distant from the scare-mongering type prose that I put up just a second ago. And to be clear, this is not just an American preoccupation or pastime. Xue Tongyan is the Dean of International Relations at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and he, along with other realists in People's Republic of China, describe what happens in the world in almost exactly the same terms. There is a quest for world domination. Now, this quest for world domination is being analyzed by researchers who do what? Look at this. This is the empirical data that enters, this is the empirical data and the calibration and the understanding of causality that enters some hugely important discussions in social science, in geopolitics. Okay? And if you are an economist, say, and you think, well, this is just political science nonsense, isn't it? Because economists, real rigorous social scientists, don't think about things this way. At least our tools don't let us think about things this way. Well, lo and behold, the Economist newspaper, who is no apologist for non-rigorous thinking, decided to talk about how the rise of China, through its implications for the international monetary system, is going to be a huge threat to the global financial architecture. Until we figure out how China, being governed by an autocratic regime with a status approach to the economy, exactly the same kind of questions that jumped out at us when we looked at that Valerie Pierre circle, how it needs to transform itself. So I leave this first part of the talk with the idea that, the economics and social science and quantitative political science literature have developed hugely important tools. These are the frontier of scientific knowledge right now. But they don't quite yet get at some really big economic questions. And they haven't yet made these big economic questions visible to the human eye. These large questions are out there. We've all been confronted with them constantly. But it's not something that enters our domain of analysis. We're stuck in this kind of a established way. When I say established, this doesn't mean this is not revolutionary. It's revolutionary relative to what was done 10, 15 years ago. But we need to push beyond to look at tools, mathematical ideas, modeling ideas, historical ideas that get at some big questions. Now, it's not to everyone's taste to want to attack big questions. Why should we? Many of my colleagues will say, look, publishing in 5-star academic journals is about formulating narrowly defined, well-circumscribed research questions that can then be attacked using finely punctuated analyses using tools that referees will be familiar with. And that's beautiful. It's a beautiful approach to doing scholarly research. What I'm trying to talk about here says all of us should maybe give a little bit of space for doing some really crazy things. Because these crazy things might actually be important, and they might help us understand, engage with the rest of social science and the establishment out there who are gearing up to go out and do war in the world. And even if they don't do it actually openly, publicly, it's a mindset that you and I, as scholars who want to be more careful, who want to be rigorous, need to be in conversation with. So I want to talk about some of these crossover questions. Now, I know I've got just a little bit of time left. I've told you some of the background to why I'm going to talk about these questions, and then I set it up so that I hope we can see we need to have the kind of analytical tools, whether it's history or political science or game theory or mathematical or statistical, to help us attack these questions, have a more enlightened conversation than just people announcing prejudices about what the rest of the world looks like, about what other parts of the world who are different from us, what they look like. And sometimes it's a matter of going out and doing sociology. Sometimes it's a matter of going here and doing some mathematics. So I want to take us through a little bit of that. And then I'll conclude in the last 5 minutes with some examples of calculations that I've done that bear on some of these issues. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through the points here. What I've just taken us through, international relations scholars will consider as a fine domain of analysis, a subfield independently interesting. But for my purposes, the way in which I try and approach this with the tools that I've got, the way I want to talk about, what we're talking about is an instance of order in the world, of world order. And for me, I define world order to mean the configuration of two things: the distribution of power across nation states and the relations among them. So within this discussion of world order will be discussion of what those of you who do international relations or otherwise might recognize as discussions of hard power and soft power. Read scholars at Harvard and elsewhere who talk about how the United States remains the repository of hard power because it remains the world's largest economy, because it's got the world's most formidable military, at the same time that it's the repository of soft power, because it is the country that everybody in the world admires and wants to emulate. Its institutions, its universities are the finest and most admired in the world. Of all the Nobel Prizes that have ever been handed out in all of human history, and America will still write the rules of international game. It will run international financial architecture. It will issue the world's reserve currency, and the rest of the world will just have to live with that. That's one instance of world order. IR scholars refer to that, to oversimplify dramatically, as an instance of unipolarity. And they refer to how after the Soviet Union collapsed, which was the last time we had a genuine possibility of multipolarity, the world has been unipolar, and the age is America's. Now, if the rise of China, the rise of the East, the rise of Singapore is something real in the kinds of crude time series graphing that you and I have just done, that you and I will want to elaborate, make more rigorous, try and put more flesh on, well, the discourse that we need to engage in is to provide empirical evidence on whether the world does remain unipolar. And if it doesn't remain unipolar, how are the other things, what are the other dimensions of analysis as social science we need to think about? The distribution of power and the relations across nation states is something that's discussed in historical, political science, and international relations terms. It would be great if those of us in this room felt that this was such an important issue. We wanted to put analytical, rigorous flesh on that. We wanted to describe world order in a mathematical way. Actually, it doesn't bother me whether it's mathematical or something else, as long as we describe it in a rigorous way that we can then have a debate on which is not just a statement about prejudices, which is not just a statement about, I've got bigger guns than you do, therefore I get to run the world. Okay? And we need to have a discussion about that. One way in which that discussion can proceed is to distinguish power and legitimacy. That yes, even as the United States or the transatlantic axis remains the central focus of hard power, soft power, financial power, and so on, legitimacy, patterns of legitimacy are changing. Now, what does patterns of legitimacy mean? Well, from a political science perspective, world order has in it structures of governance, structures of world government. And from a political science perspective, from a John Locke philosophy perspective, government should govern only when it attracts the consent of those who are governed. Only when the people that it actually sets the rules out for agree to it. So then the question is, in a world where world order is determined by the distribution of power, does that power also attract legitimacy? Well, our mind goes back to that Ken Myers picture. If that tiny circle in Southeast Asia is where the majority of the world's population lives, has anyone ever asked them that the way the United States runs the world is appropriate for them? Would they agree? Would they say yes? And given that that circle includes over 1 billion people in China, many of whom, when asked the question, do you approve of the way your government, unelected, runs your country, 80% of them give that government a thumbs up. 80% of them want that government to fix the corruption, to fix the pollution that's in that country, and they're quite happy with the way Xi Jinping is doing it. Does the United States still attract legitimacy? Now, these first 2 points, world order, distribution of power, relation across nation states, power and legitimacy, that's how many of us might say other social sciences discuss this. But you and I are economists, we're at London School of Economics, political science, or we're used to using more analytical, technical tools. We say, that's an interesting conversation you have. Let me recast your conversation in ways that I recognize and that I could then apply my tools to. So here's one possible line of attack. All previous discussion of world order in terms of the distribution of power that talks about the United States being the repository of power, that talks about the challenge that China, raises, that's a discussion about the supply of world order. If we think about world order as being a high-dimensional object out there that provides the rules and regulations, the institutions, the understanding, the architecture by which we run the world, that's a commodity. It's an economic commodity that's got very high dimensional attributes, but it's a commodity. And those who describe world order in terms of the United States having more power than anybody else, or other countries like Singapore being too small to be able to construct these architectures, are talking about the supply of world order. And when you and I, for that brief instant, when we talked about legitimacy, we veered into talking about the demand for world order. Of the 7 billion people out there who are having to live under a system of global governance, what kind of world order would they demand? What kind of world order do they need? That little picture that we drew where half the world's population lives in the Mekong Delta is the world order that we've got, the world order that they want. Okay. If you think about it as demand and supply, what's the price mechanism? Who provide, how do we equilibrate this? And if it's only the world's most powerful nations that provide world order in ways that are profitable for them, then we live in a world that is monopolistic and that is inefficient, that needs to be improved upon by properly acknowledging how world order can be redesigned. Now, what have I done? I've taken a long-standing problem from Hans Morgenthau onwards in international relations, and I've said, there's actually an economic way to think about this, that now needs you and me writing our R programs and our Python code to quantify and to try and improve. So let me see how we can do this. Now, demand and supply, so let me now move into more technical bits of the work to finish up the lecture. Okay. From Economics B, or from microeconomics in year 2 or elsewhere, you'll know that demand and supply in a properly functioning competitive market solves a welfare programming problem. It maximizes social well-being in the world. If you take away monopolies, which is what we're trying to do here, and you ask for the unconstrained demand and supply in perfectly competitive, well-functioning markets, fundamental theorem of welfare economics tells us that equilibration of demand and supply, when people are price takers, firms are price takers, don't exercise monopoly power, that maximizes social welfare. So demand and supply equilibration solves a constrained optimization program. You and I, thinking hard about this, and think about it the way that real mathematicians, not me, but real mathematicians in the maths department would be able to write down the constraint optimization program that demand and supply for world order insists on. And if you and I did this, we would have a completely different conversation with the people out there who are arguing world order needs to go US or China or bipolarity way. It would transform the narrative of social science in this domain. I don't know about you, but I'm shaking with excitement at this point. This is something that's really worth doing. Okay. And along the way, we can address important questions in political science. Okay. There are many people who believe that the world would be so much a better place if we simply brought democracy to everyone. Okay. China is going to have problems, according to this narrative. China will not be able to grow because its system of governance is inflexible. It is an autocracy. Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang and the rest of them run the country as a CEO, as a CEO that's unelected. If only they had democracy, they could become the kind of flexible, well-functioning systems that we've got in the West. That would be good. People look at Singapore and they say Singapore is an authoritarian state, taking words from the Economist newspaper. Okay. And it's a marvel that they've been able to, for so long, been able to grow to where they now have better than first world GDP. But if only they could liberalize, so that they could really transform to become a liberal democracy with free market capitalism, that would be a better system for them. It's gotten to a point where Francis Fukuyama, remember, 2 decades ago, when he announced the end of history with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the line that he took was that liberal democracy is the only viable solution for the fundamental problems in human history. Okay. What we're looking at here is the potential of trying to rethink world order, trying to rethink whether democracy has the fundamental properties that it does. If I may, let me take just 5 minutes extra. I'm running over time. Okay. Those who argue that democracy has all these nice properties must believe that there's a fundamental theorem associated with democracy, the same way that there's a fundamental theorem associated with free markets. Remember Economics B? Well-functioning markets maximize social well-being. Okay. They solve the Pareto optimum problem. Fundamental theorem of welfare economics says, provided you have well-functioning markets and a price system, no monopoly power, perfect information, the end result, the outcome when you have freedom, is something that maximizes social well-being. Well, those who argue for liberal democracy in this kind of a discussion about global governance must believe that there's a fundamental theorem of well-being that applies to democracy. Now, I don't think that there is. I've scoured the literature, I've asked other scholars elsewhere. This belief in democracy as solving the kind of fundamental theorem that we in economics have is absent. I don't know if one exists or one is possible. It's not Condorcet's theorem on voting, which is very restrictive. It is about whether in well-functioning systems, democracies produce the same kind of results that we do. Now, I want to end now. I've run a bit over time. But the search here the mathematical search here is if we can solve our constraint optimization for ordering the world, what you and I want to do is to be able to then break it down into the kinds of problems that ants in an ant colony can solve. An ant colony is not a free market. An ant colony is not a democracy. But ant colonies solve optimization problems. They figure out the optimal place to put dead bodies. They figure out the optimal place to store their food in a way that optimizes against how much energy they have to expend to move the dead bodies in different directions and to keep from the poison that these dead bodies, poisonous chemicals that these dead bodies emit. Ant colonies solve an optimization problem. No ant actually knows how to do that. Ants follow simple rules. If you and I can solve the constraint optimization problem for ordering the world, then our problem is how do we put it in a form as simple, so simple that ants are all our political leaders can understand, so when they go out and they try and run the world, all they have to do is follow simple rules. Now that's all I have to say. In 30 seconds, if I may, let me take you through the progress on this. It is possible to state what a rational world order ought to be. It solves a constraint optimization problem. We've got an interconnected world that is globalized. We've got global public goods that we need to provide, solve the problem of global climate change, keep the sea lanes safe, keep internet communications secure, deal with rogue states, protect against pandemics, protect against international financial stability. They're global public goods that we know global governance needs to provide. We simply need to put demand and supply together in a constraint optimization program. That's something that can be done in simple ways. Okay? And then the trade-off in research is how we take this general problem and describe it relative to data in ways that are feasible. What are ways that are feasible? Okay, 20 seconds. Illustration. I have 3 illustrations. I have 3 illustrations that try and bring to bear that constraint optimization problem and the big things that impact the world in a way that tries to minimize the impact ratio. The first is that the world has changed. Okay. This is how the world used to be. It was centered on the transatlantic axis, and one might argue that in a world where most economic activity, as revealed by lights in the nighttime sky, are centered on the transatlantic axis, then indeed a unipolar world where the United States and Washington, D.C. solves the problem of world order by maximizing its well-being actually solves the social welfare problem, because that's where most activity is. But of course, as you know, that's no longer the case. The world's economic center of gravity moved from the middle of the Atlantic Ocean over the last 3 decades, 5,000 kilometers across the nighttime sky, steadily eastwards, not monotonically, but in jerks, fits, and starts, but nonetheless, over time, gradually eastwards to the Arabian Peninsula, and it will continue eastwards. Those of us who are serious that world order needs to solve a social welfare mathematical programming problem, because that's the right outcome that would be good for the world, would say that this change in the underlying structure needs a change in the system of world order. Okay, now there were kind of other things that if we had time I would discuss, but let me not do that. There are technical issues involved in trying to visualize the world order. Ken Myers' picture that initiated, I hope, all our curiosity, certainly my own, in trying to deal with these problems, here it is repeated. And I said at the beginning, not only is it wrong, it doesn't solve a variational problem. What's the variational problem we'd like to solve? We'd like to know if there are maximal properties, minimal properties associated with this picture. And it turns out that there are. If you look at the world's spatial distribution of people, so it's a spatial distribution, so you need to look at it in 3-dimensional forms. Here it is viewed from North America. If you rotate it so that you rotate it eastwards, that's Africa. You rotate it a little bit further east, there you see India and Asia. And the heights and the colors of intensity of this describes the world population down to 100 square kilometers grids, which I was able to extract from CIA databases in the United States and elsewhere. And that gives us a map of the world. So if we solve the Ken-Myers problem, which we won't do, but there's a little bit of math that helps us do that, this is what we find. So doing the problem right in three-dimensional space, solving the variation problem, asking for where the world's smallest circle is that encompasses a democratic majority, it turns out to be this. It's a circle 3,300 kilometers in radius, centered in eastern Myanmar, right on the border with China. It covers India and China, but it excludes huge chunks of Japan. This is the world's smallest grid, this world's smallest circle that contains a democratic majority. And if we're going to solve our social programming problem sensitive to the needs of the world, this is where we go, this is where we need to go find the needs of the world. Now I've finished, I've totally run over time, so let me conclude. What have I done here? I've tried to do three things. I began by saying, here's an important problem that doesn't seem to be easily dealt with the tools that I and my colleagues in economics teach. But I think it's an important problem. I've tried to communicate to you why it is. And the things that we need to do on this are to engage in research that communicate with the world in a way that Ken-Myers did, minimize the impact ratio. I've told you about the crossover questions between international relations, political science, world order, and economics, and the hard math that we need to do to tackle that problem. Then I've told you about some illustrations that help us calibrate, quantify the solution to that problem. That mathematical programming problem can be solved in the abstract. We probably won't get very interesting statements out of this beyond existence and possibly uniqueness. That's not necessarily very exciting. What's exciting is to take that solution, map it against the world, the same way that we've got a world economic center of gravity, the spatial distribution of people, and then come back and ask, is the century that's to come, not only is the question is not whether it remains the American century, or whether it's the Chinese century, or whether it's Asia's century. The question that you and I, as rigorous social science thinkers, should be asking is, what's the right century for it to be placed in? And to do that, math is the way that we've got to go. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Danny. Very interesting, very enlightening, very thought-provoking. I think we have two people going to walk around with microphones because we really prefer the audience to come with the questions. That one. Okay, who likes to open?
Hi, Danny. You talk about the outcome which is best for the world in reference to your optimization problem for world order, which you were talking about. So my question is, what's better for the world in this statement, and is it the place of economics to answer normative questions like this?
Oh, excellent.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, when I say best for the world, what I mean is best in the sense of Pareto efficiency, and Pareto efficiency in a way that that tries to narrow in on the best Pareto optimal outcome. Because typically Pareto efficient outcomes will be multiple, maybe a whole big area. So, but we haven't even gotten to the point where we know what the counterpart of Pareto efficient outcomes is. I suspect that if we look around the world and we tell the world, look, you've got 4 billion people, 70% of the world, living in India, South Asia, East Asia, but we run the world from Washington, D.C. I think most reasonable people would say that's probably not an optimal outcome. That's an outcome that benefits the United States hugely. That's an outcome that, from the perspective of those who think realpolitik, the state of the world is what it is already, is probably good for the United States. But the way the United States might then use that power to find banks, find HSBC for dealing with quite appropriate regimes, dealing quite appropriately with political regimes that the United States finds its enemies in the world, I think that's probably not a good state of the world to be in. Now, is it the job of economics to do this? And you put your finger on exactly this. A lot of economics recently has become very positive-oriented. Our motto at LSE, to understand the causes of things, takes the world as given and then says, how do we explain it? So it's a very positive approach to analyzing social science. But, we know, although we don't talk about this now in technical economics that we teach, most introductory economics textbooks begin by saying there are two large strands of thinking that we need to be always aware of in economics. The positive approach, which is looking at the way the world is and then trying to explain it, and the normative approach that says that we begin with certain principles that we can agree on. The world isn't right, but we need to think about designing institutions that would improve the world. Doing the positive approach is a fine, rigorous, scientific way of doing investigation, but it runs the risk of being Pollyannish, of saying that the world that we see out there is the best that it can already be. And I think that's extremely dangerous. I think that lots of things that you and I would want to be rigorous and mathematical and strict on, that we say the world is not the best that it can be. And the only way to approach those kinds of questions is the normative way. So this is an approach that takes that second thinking to heart. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Gentleman in the back. Okay.
Hello, Professor. I'm from a very small country, Malaysia.
Okay.
Okay.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. So when I listen to your lecture, my assumption is basically, the locus of power is either in China, DC, and Kremlin, in Moscow, for example. But the calculation also basically is about the power. If its shift is either in Beijing, Kremlin, or DC. What happened to small country like Malaysia? Or, of course, Singapore also. Done very well, but it's still considered as a very small country. Yeah.
Excellent question. So this is a question, if I can expand a little bit on the role of small states in world order, and in particular in the vision of world order that I've described in this programming problem. Now, it is quite seductive and natural to think that, when we're done with that, solving these mathematical problems, that we're in a world where it's the large powers, China and the United States, India, possibly the collection of Middle Eastern countries altogether, Europe, that run the world. But part of the thinking, because that's where the geopolitical weight is, right? So isn't it correct that they will still run the world? Now, it is certainly correct if we remain with that vision of the world that says world order is determined on the supply side. Because only large countries with big geopolitical footprints can afford to put energy, could put resources into organizing the world, to providing the global public goods. How could Malaysia do that? How could Singapore do that? No matter it's a first world country, but it's only got 5 million people, its GDP is not the largest, not even in ASEAN. How could it be part of the world, part of world order? Okay. But if we step back from this supply side interpretation of world order, we ask, what does that programming problem intend to solve? It says, what's the world order that's best for the world, best in a Pareto efficient sense? It might be that when we solve that problem, we realize that actually, yes, we should let the United States be a very important part of world order as the security officer for the world. If Martians come attacking our planet, I want Americans to be manning the guns that defend us. I don't want North Koreans with their missiles defending our planet. I want the United States to be the world security officer. But where in that programming problem does it say that they should be the ones to run the international financial architecture? The international financial architecture does not need a large geopolitical footprint. It needs expertise. It needs financial engineering. It needs clever people, of which Southeast Asia has plenty. So many small states will actually have a role to play in this alternate vision of world order. Because what we need to do is to draw out the things that work best, rather than simply the things that are supplied by whoever is the biggest bully on the block. Yesterday, Ian Morris, when he talked about 20,000 years of international relations, he said, everybody always gravitates to the United States. In previous times, people gravitated towards other great powers because it's natural to be attracted to the biggest bully on the block. What I'm suggesting here is that we get our mind away from that.
Thank you. Can I have a next question? Yes, please, go ahead.
Firstly, thanks for a wonderful lecture. Secondly, your vision of a kind of perfectly competitive world order, essentially, doesn't that, I don't understand how that fits with the nature of power, that if it's allocated not monopolistically, is it really power?
Yeah. Okay.
It's a more philosophical question.
Yeah, it is. It's a very deep question. Let me try and think through how I might answer your question. Our historically conventional narrative on power is one that assigns that characteristic to attributes like economic might, military expertise, the power to attract others in the world. It's an attribute that we try and measure, and that we think, okay, if it's economic might, it means you have lots of resources in the world, and then you can throw your weight around. You can exercise that power in a way that helps you yourself. And I suppose if we think about world order in this way, I know what you mean by perfectly competitive world order, but what we want to, I think it's maybe useful also to think about it as a rational a world order that actually makes sense, rather than a world order that's just been given to us by history, because history has simply given these great empires the ability to impose their will on the rest of the world. So a world order that actually makes sense, that serves the needs of humanity. So how do we reconcile these two things? I suppose I might fall back to how, I guess if we were able to design and implement such a world order, power would become irrelevant. Because power would simply be some fluid that spills around the world, and that we just put it to where it's most useful, rather than it's being explicitly American power or Chinese power or Daesh power or anything else. It would be just something that would slosh around. It'd be like, I suppose it'd be like a veil that helps us interpret how the world runs, but it's not essential in the way that today's world order makes it essential.
Thank you. Next question.
Over here.
Over here. Thanks. Okay,
Hi.
yes,
So
please.
I think one of the main things that you brought up is kind of how mathematical techniques can be used to kind of establish the sort of Pareto optimal, or in some way optimal way of looking at a new world order or something. But I was wondering, how is there a way that you think that these kind of methods can be reconciled with other perspectives? So, for example, political science perspectives of saying that we need more sort of expression on the citizen level, more sort of ability to protest, or perhaps some kind of world citizen democracy, and how would these fit with some optimal allocation of resources?
Really interesting question. Okay, let me give you first a one-line answer that way oversimplifies, and it's not really satisfactory, but it helps us think about how we would go from there. There's a distinction, I think, between product and process. Okay, what I'm trying to get to is the final product. What's the world order that if we could put it in place, everyone would agree this is the way to go? Others who might be thinking about this in a more historical, institutional, sort of instrumental way, don't think about the final end product, but they have in mind that if we put in place certain processes, we will eventually get to a product that's satisfactory. I mean, democracy is often talked about in that way. Democracy, Winston Churchill decades ago said, democracy is the worst of all political systems, except for all the others that have been tried. It's not very, but it's not necessarily very good. We can't prove an optimality property to it. But when we try it out, it actually gets us to a place that's satisfactory. So I think of when we try and build institutions like this, rule of law, transparency, we try and strengthen civil society, we try and strengthen voice, all of these. These, I don't think anyone thinks of necessarily as products, end products in and of themselves. We think of those as part of a process that then gets us towards something that works for all of society. But there's an element of faith involved in that. I'm not, this is not, many of us, myself included, subscribe to the idea that more democracy is better than less democracy. We look around the world and we see societies that are underperforming, dysfunctional. We think if only they had free press, if only they had freedom of the media, if only they had freedom for the people to articulate their wishes, all the trappings that we associate with democracy, their government would improve. And we can see that happening in small steps, but to think that this actually gets us to a final endpoint is still a leap of faith. And I'm not the only one, far from the only one, to think of it as a leap of faith. H.L. Mencken in the 1920s, a profoundly interesting American writer, he said, everybody's going around thinking about how we need to bring democracy to the rest of the world. But then we look around and we think about what our fellow citizens are actually like. These are, he didn't think about it in exactly these terms, but these are our fellow citizens who put Donald Trump up high in the polls. So what Mencken said is that, when it comes down to it, democracy is the pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of the individually ignorant. Somehow you take people who don't know very much, but then you put them together in a way that allows them to be free to express themselves, and then you get to, through the democratic process, get to something that's actually quite good, quite wise. Churchill, of course, believed that, you did, but there's no theorem, there's no understanding that tells us why we do that. Historical studies in philosophy, they are far deeper than we have time to get into, walk all around the idea, but there's no clear resolution. No one can point to an Arrow-Debreu first and second fundamental theorem of democracy that says that you achieve satisfactory results in this way. And this is a live topic. This is a very live issue. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister, a few months ago was interviewed on BBC Hard Talk. And he was asked the question that many Singaporean politicians are asked, why don't you let your people be freer? Why don't you move towards a truer democracy? And Tharman's answer was that, it's an article of faith that if you simply unleash all kinds of freedoms in society, we will get to an outcome that is satisfactory. The way I read that is there is no theorem that says this. Believing in process is great. We should do that, but we should also be clear about what end product we're going to try and get to. And there are many examples that have been documented where trying to unleash a democratic transition, build the kinds of institutions that you described in societies that, however you think about them, whether you think of them as not yet ready or don't yet have the civil society institutions or somebody else messes up what's going on there, then end up in really quite unfortunate and disastrous circumstances. And I think we need to be very careful about that. I want to, well, on the one hand, what I'm describing here sounds god-awful, arrogant. It is not meant to be. It's simply that here's a way for us to start thinking about what the end goal is and how we organize global governance. Okay? And it's a way different from other people have thought about, but as people who are interested in the applications of mathematics, this is an area that seems ought to get traction. Lots to work out here. It's an end goal. How we get that is still wide open. And what you've described might be the right ways to get there.
Okay, question here in the front, Annelie.
Well, you're talking about the end goal. and you're describing as a constraint optimization problem. If we change the constraints, the end goal changes.
Yes.
So who sets the constraints?
Okay. Okay.
A real
very good.
mathematician there.
Yeah. Excellent question. Not only does the optimal solution change when the constraints change, but this system evolves over time. Populations grow, populations migrate. People who used to be Eastern Europeans become Americans, and will people move to China? The population shifts. The entire environment shifts. Not the constraints along with them. And then we're looking at trying to track a high-dimensional dynamical system. It's extremely tricky. I can't even solve the static problem yet in sufficient granularity that we can talk about it, but it tells me the kind of debates to have. I think of it as that we're at that stage. It tells me about what the kinds of debates we need to have and where we need to go quantify things. But the next stage will be to try and dynamicize it. And then, in principle, as you know, if we can solve that problem analytically, what we actually have is a mapping from constraints and environment to outcomes, world order. And with that mapping, we'd be able to deal with that problem. I can say that in concept, but of course, operationalizing it is an order of magnitude more difficult still. But you're absolutely right, it's extremely tricky.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Certainly.
Who sets the objective function?
Who sets the objective function? Very good. Very good. I would want the objective function to be a weighted average of people's well-beings around the world. Okay. And by manipulating the set of weights, we then trace out the Pareto efficient region. So you tell me a set of weights on people's well-beings around the world, and you might say it's perfectly fair to say, you know what, the Americans have had a really good long run at this. We should give somebody else a shot. And there are people out there talking about world order who argue in a kind of moralistic kind of way. Western Europe has spent the last 2 centuries putting carbon into the atmosphere. It's time for other countries to have their share of economic growth. There are people who make that argument. I'm not myself convinced that that's the right way to go, but that implies a set of weights in the programming problem. And if we don't like the set of weights, as we vary it, as we know in welfare economics, what we do is we trace out the Pareto efficient region, and we do that.
Okay, good. Further questions from the audience? Can we see if somebody else?
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, so this does not have to be a question that we answer in the 15 minutes or 10 minutes that we've got left. But a question that I would like people to think about is, in your own experience, from your own studies, what problem is it whose solution you would like to have that minimizes the impact ratio? What is the problem that you would propose that I add to the list that I've got here? I told you about principles. I told you when I began it was about methodology. It was about trying to think about important problems in the world that we can attack with empirical methods, with mathematical ideas that make a huge impact, but at the same time don't take a huge amount of calculation. The Ken Myers example was that, and then sort of my own little variation on that tried to do that. So in your own experience, from what you're studying now, from the course lectures that you're going to go to, either tomorrow or next term, ask, what is that problem that in your course, the course that you are studying in that module, which one problem is it that you would like the solution to have a minimal impact ratio on? That's my question.
Challenging. Okay, any answer to that? Not yet. Then we go back to questions. I think, Elena, you have your second one. Okay.
In the debate, I haven't followed the debate about, the power, who is going to decide what. But this is a question, some people say, okay, the Americans had it good so far. Let's give more weight to the opinions of Indians and Chinese and Malaysians, etc. male people in the world had it good so far. Whoever talks about give more weight to female opinions?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, I haven't had opportunity to talk about that here. I mean, it's an issue that's come up, for instance, throughout Asia in the gender imbalance problem. Amartya Sen, about a decade ago, wrote a book about India's missing girls. And what he was referring to at the time was that, in societies that are otherwise unrestricted, you would expect a certain gender ratio between boys and girls born. And the fact is, India has way, way fewer girls born than boys. It's a huge gender imbalance, and that reflects a preference among certain families that have taken really have had very tragic consequences. Now, Amartya Sen wrote that book. It's about the disgrace that is India's missing girls, the disgrace and the shame, and the tragedy that's India's missing girls. And at the same time, a lot of people have been pointing fingers at China, because China, about 15, 20 years ago, put in place a draconian one-child policy. So people were only allowed to have families were only allowed to have one children, at least in the popular narrative. In the reality in China itself, if you were a minority, or if you had certain circumstances, or you lived in certain parts of China, you could have more than one children, or more than one child, or you had to, certain other arrangements could be made. But the way in which China told the rest of the world was that China had moved to a one-child policy. And people observed that gender imbalance of the same kind that had been observed for India was emerging in China in a very dramatic way. Many more boys were born than girls. Now, those of you who are familiar with that, with what's going on there, you know that, in certain Asian cultures, and particularly in Chinese cultures, there's a distinct preference for male offspring. And so with a technology that allows people to discern whether the unborn child is a boy or a girl, you can imagine the tragic consequences of something that was actually meant to evade the trap of having too many people. Having a one-child policy is having too many people. And so if your country is starving, your agricultural production is insufficient, you're trying to bring the population under control, you might think one-child policy is a good idea, but one of its unintended consequences was this gender imbalance. And those who criticize China point to China and how terrible an outcome that's been. But of course, actually, what we know is that this regularity, this empirical regularity, is observed across all of Asia. It did not take did not need a one-child policy for there to emerge this really quite very tragic and sad outcome across all of Asia. There's a dramatic gender imbalance in favor of boys over girls. And very soon there will be 24 million more young Chinese men than young Chinese women. Similar numbers appear for the other billion people economy, India. Now, if we take this discussion a little bit further, simple economics B kind of reasoning ought to tell us that what that means is that the shadow value on girls starts to rise. If we're 24 million more young men than young women, well, the way to equilibrate that demand and supply is for the price on girls to rise. Very tragically, that has not happened. Not in China and not in India. Instead, what's emerged is a culture of kidnapping and violence in certain parts of these different countries. So it's a huge problem. It's a hugely important problem. And it's an important problem that appears in terms of these billions of people scale. It doesn't enter the kind of calculations that I've done. It ought to, but I haven't quite figured out how it would connect. But it's a very important problem you raise, hugely important.
Thank you. More question? Yes, that corner. Please go ahead.
Hi. You spoke about how the economic center of gravity is shifting towards the east. I was just wondering, when you're trying to build that into your model and thinking about the constraints, you kind of have to bring into the fact bring into it the fact that you have big institutions like the IMF, which are kind of, they deliberate where that center of gravity is. So by adding China's currency into the reserve currency, is like, that's a major shift, and it's something that is kind of aside of what we as economic researchers can say, because that's an IMF decision. So how do you account for decisions made by sort of private institutions affecting the world?
Excellent question. Let me take it in two parts. There's a question about what these large global institutions do, which ought to be part of the solution to this programming problem, even if they don't know it. In that process building way, they ought to be doing the right thing. And then the private institutions. So the first observation I might make is that actually the international financial architecture has not yet adapted as well to the changing global economy. And that shows up in, for instance, there are institutional reasons why they haven't. So we like to think that over the last 2 weeks, when the IMF accepted China's RMB into its packet, into its basket of currencies that form special drawing rights, well, that's a reflection of the kinds of changes that we're seeing here. But that change is actually far smaller than one might hope, given the actual large-scale changes in the world. So the allocation of voting rights and quotas at the IMF, the power of the IMF, the World Bank, and institutions like Asian Development Bank continue to be dominated by American interests. My colleague, Professor Robert Wade in International Development, part of his research is tracking the allocation of voting rights, the discrepancy between what has been agreed on in practice to try and take into account this shift in the global economy and what has actually transpired. And a lot of what Robert and other people's analysis shows is that US Congress is a huge obstacle to the reallocation of these voting and decision rights. So the large global institutions have not yet adjusted the way they should. They are still dominated in that accounting by transatlantic-centric thinking. But the RMB inclusion in the basket is a small change in that direction. Part of a reflection of these institutional lethargy is the formation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, which China and India and other countries have attempted to build an alternative set of global international institutions that could undertake these kinds of policies. At this point, the AIIB and the BRICS Bank remain quite small. Each of these has a balance sheet of about $100 billion. That sounds like a lot of money, except that the Asian Development Bank, the ADB, which is part of the old system, already had $160 billion. The World Bank has $220 billion, and the IMF has $1 trillion in its balance sheet. The new banks that have emerged from this shift in the global economy are still small players relative to how global decisions are made. So we're far from that yet. We're far from that. And then with the private institutions, we're even further entrenched still here. Although private institutions are actually quite sensitive to these market demands. So for instance, HSBC every few years announces it's going to pull its headquarters out of London and move to Hong Kong. There are institutions that have set up, they have set up headquarters in Singapore and in other locations out east. So some of the changes are in the direction that's predicted by the kinds of calculations that we're doing here, but there is a huge lag and an inertia.
Thank you. One more question. Yes.
Hello. A couple of times during your talk, I was reminded of the class of philosophers described by Plato, who run the place. Do you see this as a role that economists play in maximizing allocation problems? Yeah,
excellent question. And of course, you might lump me in with those philosophers in a negative light, right? It's not. I shouldn't feel flattered that you think I should belong in that, or this discussion belongs in that category. You're right. It's there's a naive idealism associated with these kinds of calculations and this kind of a narrative. And in opposition to that, colleagues of mine in international relations, Chris Hughes, and others who are with the kind of a more realist approach to international relations argue that this approach is not very helpful. Yeah, absolutely right. I agree with you. This is naive and idealistic. But I think it's helpful to begin there. And I don't think of it as just as naive idealism. I think of it as tracing out an endpoint. And I think of realism, or people who are firmly grounded in how we do things in the world, as being people who insist that we get process in place. And I'm firmly with that. So a next step beyond this is to think about how we solve the ant colony problem. Okay, the ant colony has a very clear, idealized goal. Hide the dead bodies. Move the dead bodies away so that it doesn't poison us, but don't insist that we move it so far away that we use up all our energy. So we move it at an optimal distance. Ants solve that problem, not because they solve the mathematical programming problem, but because they're given simple rules. Those simple rules implement this naive idealist position. So I want to solve the ant colony problem. The ant colony problem is the bridge between the Platonic naive idealism and what actually happens in the world. So ant colonies, that's next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's just about time for one short question, if anybody is very keen. If not, then let me thank Danny again. Very inspiring and thought-provoking talk, kind of giving us all something to think about over the Christmas break. I mean, before we all kind of leave, I also would like to thank the Applicable Mathematics Society, the people, for the wonderful job of kind of getting Danny here, getting it all organized, and getting so many people here. As usual, there are always people behind the screens who do most of the work. Definitely not me. I mean, I'm not behind the screen, so I probably didn't do anything. From the mathematics department, that is Rebecca Lump. Is she still here? No, I think she kind of had to leave. Our research administrator, who did a lot of the kind of the practical and a lot of the announcements on Twitter and related social media. So thank you to Rebecca. And yeah, for that, well, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for who's still watching us, for watching us. It will be available and will remain on YouTube. I'm sure that the society will kind of get the announcements out, all the relevant links. And for me, kind of on behalf of the mathematics department, I hope this is just the start of a kind of a more regular series of public events, kind of thought-provoking speakers, good ideas, discussions, and kind of to putting mathematics on the map. We know where it should be, but the rest of the world still needs to kind of be convinced. So spread the news and kind of, for instance, by this kind of activities. Well, thank you very much, all.